They saw a frail old woman, 82 years old, a cheap drugstore cane, and a nervous, shuffling walk. The prosecutor, a slick young man named Jennings, couldn't even look at me without sighing. He saw a burden. He saw a senile witness. He didn't see the retired Supreme Court justice who had designed this entire trap. And he had no idea that when he called me confused, he wasn't just losing his case, he was ending his career. The courtroom smelled of stale coffee and old floor wax. I sat on the hard wooden bench in the gallery, my back straight. I had been sitting for 3 hours. The defendants sat at their table, a row of 3 men in dark, expensive suits. They whispered to each other behind their hands. They looked relaxed. They looked bored. Their lawyers, 5 of them, were sharp and fast. They looked like tailored sharks. The company was Guardian Solutions, a predatory name. It promised peace of mind. It delivered financial ruin. My best friend Eleanor was one of their victims. Eleanor, who had taught me how to fly fish, was now living in a state-funded room, her savings gone. This case was supposed to be the public's answer. Instead, it was a joke. He told me it was an investment consolidation, said Mr. Henderson on the stand. He was 78, a retired postal worker. He twisted his hearing aid in his ear. The prosecutor, ADA Mark Jennings, sighed. He was a young man, 34, with a sharp haircut and a cheap suit that he tried to make look expensive. He paced in front of the jury box, his hands shoved in his pockets. "Mr. Henderson, we've been over this," Jennings said, his voice tight with annoyance. "Just tell the jury what you lost." "Objection," one of the defense lawyers said, standing up so fast his chair screeched. Asked and answered. Counsel is badgering his own witness. "Sustained," the judge said. I watched the judge. Maria Chen, 55 years old, dark hair pulled into a severe bun, her face a mask of judicial granite. 30 years ago, she was my first law clerk. She was brilliant then, and she was brilliant now. Her eyes scanned the courtroom, missing nothing. They settled on me for half a second, then moved on. There was no flicker of recognition, no sign she was a professional. She was waiting, just like I was. "No further questions," Jennings snapped, and he sat down heavily. The head defense attorney stood up. He smiled at Mr. Henderson. It was a terrible smile. "Mr. Henderson," he said, his voice smooth. "You testified that you read the contract, correct?" "Well, yes, but—" "And you signed it?" "Yes. And you received quarterly statements?" I think so." "They were very confusing." "Confusing," the attorney repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "Or is it, Mr. Henderson, that you simply made a bad investment and are now looking for someone else to blame?" "Objection!" Jennings shouted, standing up again. "I'll allow it," Judge Chen said. "The witness may answer." Mr. Henderson looked at the defense attorney. He looked at the jury. He looked at his hands. I don't know," he whispered. He was rattled, broken, exactly as the defense had planned. By the time he left the stand, the jury just looked confused. The case was falling apart, one confused witness at a time. Jennings stood, his face flushed. He looked at his notes, shuffled them, and then looked toward the gallery. "The prosecution calls its final witness," he announced, his voice flat with defeat. "Evelyn Miller. That was my cue. I waited a beat." I took a slow breath. I let my shoulders slump forward, rounding my spine. I gripped the handle of the cheap aluminum cane I had bought at a drugstore. I pushed myself up, making a small, soft "oh" sound, just loud enough for the people in my row to hear. I began the long walk, clack, tap, shuffle, clack, tap, shuffle. The sound of the cane on the polished floor was the only sound in the room. Every eye was on me. I saw the defendant's table. One of the lawyers smirked. I heard Jennings let out a quiet, frustrated sigh. He was annoyed. He was being forced to babysit another old woman. I reached the witness box. The bailiff, a kind-faced man, offered me a hand. I waved him off with a trembling smile. "I can manage, thank you, young man," I said, my voice thin and reedy. I settled into the chair. It was too big. I let myself look small. "Please state your full name and spell the last," the clerk said. "Evelyn. Evelyn Miller. Miller." I took the oath, my hand raised, letting it shake just slightly. I sat down and folded my hands over the cane's handle. I looked at Mark Jennings. I gave him a nervous, grandmotherly smile. He didn't smile back. "Mrs. Miller," he began, "can you tell the jury in your own words what happened?" Try to be clear. His condescension was a physical thing. I could feel it radiating from him. I flinched, as if a sudden noise had startled me. I looked around the big, intimidating room. "Oh my," I whispered. "It's all so loud." I turned back to Jennings. "The young man from Guardian, he was so nice. He came to my home. He said he'd handle everything, all the paperwork. He said I wouldn't have to worry anymore." I leaned forward as if sharing a secret. "I'm just an old woman, you know. I didn't understand the fine print." I saw the defense lawyer's hand go up. He was already on his feet. "Objection." The voice was sharp, cutting. It was the lead defense attorney, Harrison. He was on his feet, his chair pushed back. He looked annoyed, but his eyes were bright. He saw his opening. "The witness's own testimony is an admission of incompetence," Harrison said, addressing Judge Chen. "She claims she was confused. Confused is not a legal state. Your Honor, is the witness competent to testify at all?" I could feel the jury's eyes on me. They were a mix of faces, men and women, all looking tired and a little lost. They looked at me, this frail old woman, and they saw what Harrison wanted them to see. A liability. Mark Jennings stood up. His face was red. I expected him to defend me, to argue for the validity of his own witness. That is the standard procedure. Instead, he laughed. It was not a friendly sound. It was a short, sharp puff of air filled with frustration. He turned, not to the defense, but to Judge Chen. "Your Honor, my apologies for the witness," he said, waving a dismissive hand toward me. Well, he let the pause hang there, inviting everyone to fill in the blank. The defense table was smiling now. "She's a confused old woman," Jennings finished. The words landed in the quiet courtroom with a heavy thud. I did not move. I kept my eyes on Jennings. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the judge, trying to share a look of mutual understanding, as if they were the only two sane people in the room. "Mr. Jennings," Judge Chen said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Watch yourself." "Of course, Your Honor," Jennings said, his tone slick and false. He turned to the jury. "My point is simply this. It's clear she's senile." There was a gasp from the gallery. I saw the court reporter's fingers freeze on her machine for a second. "This is exactly what these companies prey on," Jennings continued, his voice rising. He was on a roll now. He thought he was saving his case. People who can't remember what they had for breakfast. People who don't understand the fine print because they can't understand anything. He was using my own words against me. He was confirming the defense's entire argument. He was, in legal terms, an arrogant fool. I looked down. I had to. I stared at the handle of my cane. I let my hands tremble. I made my breathing shallow, as if I were about to cry. I let the shame he was projecting onto me look like it was sticking. I was not ashamed. I was angry, the cold, precise anger of an iceberg. But he saw only the frail, defeated victim. The jury was horrified. I saw a woman in the back row wince. A man with a thick mustache was glaring at Jennings. They didn't look at me with confidence. They looked at me with pity. Pity does not win lawsuits. The defense team was silent. They were winning and they weren't having to do a thing. Jennings was destroying his own case, witness by witness. He had given them the exact soundbite they needed for a mistrial. "Your Honor," Jennings said, turning back to the bench, high on his own terrible performance. In light of her obvious state, I'm not sure this witness can even provide a credible, that is enough. Mr. Jennings. Judge Chen's voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a razor. It stopped Jennings mid-sentence. His mouth hung open. The silence that followed was absolute. The silence in the courtroom was a heavy weight. Mark Jennings stood frozen, his mouth still slightly open. The defense attorneys, who had been enjoying the show, were now sitting perfectly still. They sensed the change in the air. Judge Maria Chen pushed her chair back. The legs made a quiet, deliberate scrape against the floor. She stood up. Instantly, the entire courtroom rose with her. The bailiff's voice was sharp. All rise. Judge Chen looked out over the room, her face impossible to read. She did not look at me. She did not look at the jury. She looked only at the prosecutor. Mr. Jennings, she said, her voice clear and carrying in the still room. You've been practicing in my court for 3 years. It was not a question. It was a statement. Yes, Your Honor, Jennings said. His voice was a thin, reedy thing. In that time, she continued, I have expected a certain level of preparation, a certain awareness. Have you ever read the Seventh Circuit's opinion on elder fiduciary duty versus state? I kept my head down, but I knew that case. I knew it very well. Jennings was visibly thrown. This was not about his witness anymore. This was about him. Yes, Your Honor, of course. It's a key precedent, is it? Judge Chen said. Then perhaps you recognize the author. She paused. Then slowly, she turned her head and looked directly at me, sitting in the witness box. Mr. Jennings, she said, her voice dropping, do you have any idea who this is? The entire courtroom followed her gaze. Every eye, the jury, the defendants, the gallery was on me. Jennings looked at me. He really looked at me. His arrogant smirk was gone. His face was pale. He was trying to understand, trying to see what the judge saw. He saw a woman in a simple dress with gray hair and a cane. He saw nothing. He shook his head, a small jerky movement. He was, at last, scared. Judge Chen's voice was cold and clear. This confused old woman, Mr. Jennings, is Justice Evelyn Miller. The name hit the room. I heard at least 3 distinct gasps. I saw the court reporter's head jerk up, her eyes wide. She sat on the Supreme Court of the United States for 24 years. The air left the room. The lead defense attorney, Harrison, looked like he had been punched. He was staring at me, his mouth open. The relaxed, bored defendants were now sitting ramrod straight, their faces ashen. They finally understood. But Judge Chen was not finished. She wrote the opinion that set the national precedent for elder fraud, she said. Her voice ringing with a cold fury I remembered well from her clerkship. The precedent your entire case is built on. Jennings was white. He looked like he was going to be sick. She is not Evelyn, Judge Chen commanded, her gaze fixed on the prosecutor. She is not ma'am. She is Your Honor. She let that sit for 1, 2, 3 seconds. You will apologize to Justice Miller, she said, and then you will sit down. Every head turned back to Jennings. He was shaking. He looked from Judge Chen back to me. His eyes were wide with pure professional terror. He stammered. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. I apologize. Your Honor. I looked up. I let my shoulders straighten, just a fraction. I let the confused fog in my eyes clear. I met his gaze, and for the first time in that courtroom, he saw me. I looked up. I let my shoulders straighten, one vertebra at a time, until my spine was as straight as it had been on the federal bench. I felt the ache in my joints, but I did not let it show. I took my trembling hands off the cane and placed them firmly on the railing of the witness box. They were perfectly still. I looked at Mark Jennings. His face was a mess of shock and dawning horror. Apology noted, Mr. Jennings, I said. My voice was different. The thin, reedy tremble was gone. My voice was now my own, the one I had used for 24 years to deliver opinions, question attorneys, and manage a high court. It was clear, precise, and it carried. Jennings sank into his chair as if his legs had given out. I then turned my head just enough to address the bench. I gave a small formal nod to the woman who was my former clerk. "Your Honor," I said, "if I may continue my testimony?" Judge Maria Chen's face remained a mask of judicial calm, but her eyes were sharp. "Please proceed, Justice Miller." "Thank you," I said. I turned in the witness chair. I did not look at the prosecutor. I did not look at the defense. I looked at the 12 men and women in the jury box. They were no longer looking at me with pity. They were looking at me with a stark, focused attention that bordered on fear. They were leaning forward. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," I began, my voice filling the space, "we can now dispense with the theater." I saw the defense attorney, Harrison, stiffen. "In a few moments, Mr. Harrison," I said, nodding toward him, "will have a chance to cross-examine me. He will likely try to pivot. He will try to tell you that my performance proves I am a manipulator, that I am unreliable." Harrison's face paled. I had just taken away his entire strategy. "He will tell you," I continued, "that the contract I signed with Guardian Solutions is ironclad. He will point to its clauses. He will say that my friend Eleanor and Mr. Henderson and I were all reasonable persons entering into a reasonable agreement." I paused. "He will be correct on one point. The law does rely on a reasonable person understanding." I let my gaze travel across the jury, one by one. "I am the reasonable person." A few jurors nodded. "In fact," I said, my voice hardening, "I helped define it. In the 2008 case, Miller v. Aegis Trust, I wrote the majority opinion, the one that clarified the legal and fiduciary duties owed to vulnerable persons. The very standard for this case." I turned back to the defense table. Harrison was not writing notes. He was just staring. "And I can tell you," I said, "as the law's foremost expert on this subject, that the Guardian Solutions contract is not just predatory. It is not just unethical." I leaned forward, my voice dropping but losing none of its power. "It is profoundly and intentionally fraudulent." The room was absolutely silent. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. "The contract's own language," I explained, "creates a fiduciary duty, a duty of trust. It then violates that trust with a fee structure designed to drain a client's entire savings in under 60 months. And that is not a service. It is a time-release theft. I had just given the jury the legal justification they needed. Now I would give them the facts. And I would bury the prosecution for his incompetence at the same time. "Mr. Jennings," I said, turning to him. He flinched as if I had struck him. "You failed to introduce the defendant's internal marketing memos as evidence, the ones that refer to their clients as dwindling assets and end-of-life accounts." Jennings' face was chalk white. He knew he was finished. "You failed to subpoena their chief financial officer who signed off on those memos. You failed because you, like them, saw only confused old women." I looked from Jennings to the defense table and then back to the jury. They saw senility. They saw an opportunity. I saw a violation of the Seventh Circuit's ruling, the one I wrote. My friend Eleanor is not in a courtroom. She is in a state facility. Because these men, I pointed at the defendants, and their lawyers and an incompetent prosecution all believed I was just a confused old woman. I took a breath. The ruse is over. Let us at last begin my actual testimony. I turned my attention to the defense table. Harrison was already getting to his feet, his face dark, but Judge Chen held up a hand. "Mr. Harrison, sit down," she ordered. Her voice was firm. "Justice Miller is still providing her direct testimony." "You will have your turn." He sat, but his posture was rigid. He knew what was happening. His entire case was evaporating. I turned back to the jury. Let us begin with the document that started this all. The Guardian Solutions Client Agreement. Mr. Jennings, I said, my voice polite, please project Exhibit 4A onto the monitors. Mark Jennings, looking small at his table, fumbled with his laptop mouse. His hands were shaking. He clicked a button, and the first page of the contract appeared on the large screens facing the jury. Thank you, I said. Now please turn to page 14, Section 9, Subsection B, the clause titled Asset Management. Jennings clicked again. The text, dense and full of legal jargon, filled the screens. This clause, I explained, grants Guardian Solutions the authority to reallocate client assets to maximize long-term stability. A reasonable-sounding phrase. It's what I was told when I signed. Now please look at Exhibit 7C, the internal fee schedule. Objection! Harrison shouted, leaping up. The witness is now directing the prosecution. And she is testifying to evidence not in the record. This is highly improper. Judge Chen looked at him, her expression cold. Mr. Harrison, the witness is recounting her personal knowledge of the documents she signed or was prevented from seeing. She is a material witness in a fraud case. And, she added, her voice dropping, she is the nation's foremost expert on the very subject of this trial. Your objection is noted. It is overruled. Sit down. Harrison sat. I continued, my voice calm. This fee schedule, which was never provided to me, or to Mr. Henderson, or to my friend Eleanor, details what reallocation truly means. It means moving a client's savings from secure bonds into a series of proprietary Guardian mutual funds. These funds, as listed in Exhibit 9, carry an annual management fee of 12%. I let the jury absorb that number. 12%, compounded. When combined with the standard advisory fee listed on page 4, the total cost drains an average of 22% of a client's assets per year. I did the math for them. The long-term stability they promise is on average 48 months. After that, the asset, the human being, is depleted. I looked at the 3 defendants, the men in the expensive suits. One of them was now sweating, dabbing at his forehead with a handkerchief. This was not a bad investment, as your counsel suggested, Mr. Henderson. This was a 5-year execution plan for a life savings. I then moved to the memos. The memos Mr. Jennings mentioned were sent to me by an anonymous whistleblower inside Guardian Solutions. A young paralegal who saw her own grandmother's account being drained. In them, the defendants refer to clients in my age bracket as LTAs, short for limited time assets. Objection. Harrison was on his feet again, his voice cracking with desperation. Hearsay. Lack of foundation. This is a fabrication. Your Honor, I said calmly, turning to Judge Chen, I am not speaking as a lawyer. I am testifying as a victim. I am recounting the facts of the fraud perpetrated against me, facts that include the company's internal language for its victims. The defense seems very eager to prevent the jury from hearing how this fraud was planned. Judge Chen looked at Harrison. Mr. Harrison, I am warning you one last time. Every objection you make confirms this testimony. Do you wish to cross-examine this witness, or do you wish to be held in contempt? Harrison was breathing hard. He was trapped. Cross-examination, Your Honor. When she is finished. I am finished, I said. I folded my hands over the handle of my cane. I have established the facts, the motive, and the means. The prosecution, had he been competent, could have done this in an afternoon. I turned my full attention to Harrison. I gave him a small, cold smile. Your witness, counselor. Harrison rose from his chair. He walked slowly toward the witness box. His face was no longer pale. It was a deep mottled red. He was furious, but he was also a professional. He was trying to recenter, to find a new path. He couldn't attack the law. I had written it. He couldn't attack the facts. I had just laid them bare. He had only one move left. He had to attack me. "Justice Miller," he began, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Or should I say Mrs. Miller? It's hard to keep track. Which one are you today?" The jury stirred. It was a risky question, bordering on disrespect, but he was desperate. "I am Justice Evelyn Miller," I replied, my voice even. "I am also Mrs. Evelyn Miller. The two are not in conflict." "I see," he said, pacing. "And which one of them shuffled into this courtroom? Which one of them pretended to be confused and scared? Was that Justice Miller or Mrs. Miller?" "That was an 82-year-old woman with arthritis, Mr. Harrison," I said calmly. I gripped the handle of my cane. "This cane is not a prop. The ache in my spine is quite real." "Oh, I'm sure it is," he sneered. "But the rest?" "Oh my, it's so loud." The confused old woman. "That was a lie, wasn't it?" "I never said I was confused, Mr. Harrison. That was your word. And Mr. Jennings' word." "A lie of omission," he snapped. "You actively deceived this court. You put on a performance by your own admission. You came here to trick us." "No," I said, my voice firm. "I came here to be a witness. You, Mr. Jennings, and your clients." I gestured to the pale men at the defense table. "Did the rest." "What does that mean?" "It means you did not see a confused old woman. You wanted to see a confused old woman. You saw my gray hair, you saw my cane, and you saw a victim. You saw exactly what your clients train their salesmen to see. An easy mark." I turned slightly to the jury. "You saw what you expected to see. You projected incompetence onto me because of my age. That is the very definition of ageism. The bias your clients built their entire business on." Harrison's face contorted. He knew I was right. He knew the jury saw it too. He was losing, and he was losing badly. He lunged. "This is a conspiracy," he shouted, pointing a finger, moving from me to the bench. "This whole thing. You set this up. You and the judge. She was your clerk." A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. It was a fatal error. A lawyer never attacks the bench. Judge Chen's voice was a sheet of ice. "Mr. Harrison, you are 1 second from a contempt citation that will end your career. You will retract that accusation. Now." But I spoke before he could. "Judge Chen's integrity is absolute," I said, my voice ringing with authority. "I have not spoken to Her Honor outside of a public proceeding in 15 years. I then looked back at Harrison. He was frozen, his finger still pointing. "But you are right about one thing, Counselor," I said, my voice dropping. "I did set a trap. I did not need to manufacture one. The trap was your client's own prejudice. Their belief that the elderly are weak, frail, and stupid." I held his gaze. "That was the bait, and they, and you, and the prosecution all walked right into it. I simply allowed you to see me as you see all your victims." Harrison stood there, speechless. His mouth opened and closed. He had nowhere else to go. He had lost the case, and he had just destroyed his own reputation. Slowly, as if his bones had gone soft, he collapsed into his chair. He put his head in his hands. "No further questions," he mumbled into his palms. I sat there for a moment in the profound silence. The case was over. The jury was staring at me, not with pity and not with awe, but with understanding. I looked at the 3 defendants. They were ruined. I turned to Judge Chen. "I believe that is all." Judge Chen nodded. "The witness is excused." The bailiff, the same kind-faced man who had offered me his hand, now approached the box. He didn't offer his hand this time. He simply opened the gate and stood back, his expression one of profound respect. I stood up. I gripped my cane. I felt the familiar ache in my hips, the throb in my knees. They were real. I was not a superhero. I was just an old woman who was tired of being underestimated. Clack, tap, shuffle. I made my way across the courtroom floor. The silence was absolute. I walked past the defense table. Harrison did not look up. The 3 defendants stared at me, their faces a mixture of hatred and terror. They finally saw me, not as an asset, but as the person who had just taken away their lives. I walked past the prosecution table. Mark Jennings was sitting stiffly, staring at a blank legal pad. His career was over. He had publicly humiliated a Supreme Court justice and demonstrated profound incompetence, all in one afternoon. He would be lucky to get a job writing parking tickets. I did not go back to the gallery. A different bailiff met me at the door and escorted me to a small private conference room. "The judge thought you would be more comfortable here," he said. I sat in a padded chair and waited. I waited for 4 hours. The wait for a jury is its own kind of torture. It is the one part of the law you cannot control, predict, or argue with. At 5:14 p.m., the bailiff returned. "They're back." The walk back to the courtroom was quiet. I was given a seat in the front row of the gallery, just behind the prosecution. "All rise," the bailiff called. We stood. Judge Chen took the bench. The jury filed in. They did not look at the defendants. In all my years, that was the most reliable sign. "Mr. Foreman," Judge Chen said, "has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "And on the charge of conspiracy to commit wire fraud against defendant Alistair Finch, how do you find?" "Guilty." A sob broke the silence from the defense side. "On the charge of wire fraud." "How do you find?" "Guilty." "On the charge of conspiracy to commit wire fraud against defendant Robert Shaw." "How do you find?" "Guilty." It continued for 42 counts. Guilty, 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 for all 3 of them. The corporate revenge was complete. Judge Chen thanked the jury for their service. She set a sentencing date. She denied bail. The defendants who had walked in that morning in expensive suits were told to stand. Handcuffs were clicked onto their wrists. They were led out of the courtroom, their faces gray. The courtroom began to empty. I saw Harrison stuffing papers into a briefcase, his movements jerky and angry. I saw Jennings, who just left his notes on the table and walked out, a hollowed-out man. I stood up. I gripped my cane. I took my time. I walked out of the courtroom into the great hall. It was loud now. Reporters who had gotten the news were running, shouting my name. "Justice Miller! Justice Miller!" A comment. I just kept walking. Clack, tap, shuffle. I pushed open the heavy main doors. The late afternoon sun hit my face. It was bright. A car was waiting at the curb. The door opened, and a woman helped push a wheelchair onto the sidewalk. It was Eleanor, my friend. Her hair was white, and her hands were thin, but her eyes were the same. They were bright. I walked over to her. She looked up at me. "Did we win, Evelyn?" she whispered. I sat down on the bench beside her wheelchair. I reached over and put my hand on hers. It was warm. "Yes, Eleanor," I said. "We won. I was just an old woman sitting on a bench with her friend. But we were the women who had brought down an empire, and they would never, ever make the mistake of calling us confused again."